Say your name for the record.
Pazuzu Algarad.
What does that mean? That for me?
It's a Lord's name.
What does Eli stand for?
Oh, that's good.
Walls marred with satanic symbols.
You're greeted with this smell of just ammonia and urea. It just smells like straight urine. Rotting matter greets you as soon as that door is opened.
Floors coated in filth, bugs, and feces.
Dude, your house smells like death.
Human beings would just pop a squat in a corner, take a crap, and God knows when it would get cleaned up, or the dogs might eat it, or whatever.
Doors printed in black ink with the ramblings of a madman.
When I saw their front door, I didn't want to be there. I wanted to leave immediately.
These are just small glimpses of the house of horrors that Pazuzu Algarad and his followers resided in the cozy bedroom community of Clemens, North Carolina. But the depraved, inhumane things that truly took place inside this house are beyond comprehension.
He would eat the heart of it and then burn the flesh of the rabbit.
Were the horrific secrets held in the house and buried in the backyard the result of a man in Satan's grasp, or the unraveling psyche of a man who never had a chance?
Did you ever stop and think why the ground is so uneven out here?
Pazuzu Algarad wasn't always known as Pazuzu. In fact, for the majority of his life, up until he was 24 years old, he was an unremarkable, blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid with a sad smile. Johnny Lawson. Those around him had no idea that he would one day become one of the most notoriously twisted killers of all time.
I despise the human race. People are ugly and pointless creatures. I sit back and watch them and they anger me. I should get a medal for murdering these stupid...
Johnny, as his childhood friends and family called him, was born August 12, 1978, on the foggy coast of California, just outside of San Francisco. His childhood is as much of a mystery as his mental state, mainly because he can't seem to keep his story straight himself. His followers would later claim that Pazuzu told him that he was raised in Iraq by a high priest, but really this was far, far from the truth.
Little Johnny was not right, and everybody knew it.
For years, they were a normal family.
Johnny was raised by a single mother when his parents divorced soon after he turned 8 years old. By then, he and his mother had moved to cozy, all-American Clemens, North Carolina, just outside Winston-Salem. If you were to take a snapshot from the 50s of the perfect family, you'd find quite a few households to match Clemens. In fact, people go to church every Sunday here, and the majority of households, a whopping 84%, are married couples with children. From the outside looking in, it seems as though it would be a perfect community to raise a child in, and for some, it may very well be. But for Johnny, things were challenging from the start. At a very young age, he looked like everyone else, dressing up in cowboy outfits, hat included, and playing outside with a smile on his face. But as time went on, things started to change.
Cynthia says she first noticed a change in her son when she remarried.
People who knew him as a child described him as a bit emotional and found him unusual compared to his peers.
When I met Johnny, he was weird. He wore this big cape, black cape with his teeth. Jason, Freddy Krueger, the vampire movie, he was all those people.
I assume I need no introduction.
His childhood babysitter told reporters that on more than one occasion, she felt Johnny was a melancholy child. He didn't quite fit in, and yet she considered him to be a funny, caring, and kind boy compared to his classmates. He loved horror movies and often wore a cape, running around and pretending to be a vampire for days on end. His babysitter alleges that Johnny had a reason to be melancholy. His father moved back to California, lessening his contact with Johnny and leaving his mother as a single parent. According to the babysitter, Johnny's mother Cynthia was involved in drugs and alcohol, and she often brought men in and out of Johnny's home and his life.
She drinks a lot for once, and she go with all these guys. I mean, she leave Johnny behind, and there she goes. Johnny see all that stuff, and, the little kid, get in his mind, like, why my mama do that?
it's clear that Johnny wasn't living the stable, happy life that kids thrive with. This would soon begin to take its toll and eventually lead to the disappearance of both pets as well as people in the local community.
When Johnny was probably 8 years old, Johnny was very abusive, of her. He hit her and stuff like that. So she put her in a mental hospital. And me and her went to see Johnny, and my heart broke because I said, that little boy, he didn't need to be there. The one that needs to be there is the woman, the mama.
At 13, Johnny completely cut contact with his father and would thereafter begin to experiment with drugs as well as alcohol, a blazing red flag indicating potential mental illness. Typically, those who are struggling with any type of mental disorder, from bipolar to eating disorders to depression, studies have found that these people are much more likely to experience substance abuse at a young age. And those who abuse substances are often clinging to them because they tend to alleviate emotions that they cannot quite understand, and not to mention they often serve as a perfect escape for them. These are the very emotions that would engulf Johnny for the rest of his life. He was ruthlessly teased and called Turd Boy, and while some kids may be cruel, they're not always clever. The name-calling deeply hurt Johnny all the same, and by 13, he was already vocally considering ending his life. But despite this, little was done to help. His mother claims that he was diagnosed with agoraphobia, schizophrenia, and psychosis, but that attending psychiatrist appointments and therapy was way too expensive for them to afford. This is a tragic reality that dominates the United States healthcare system, preventing people like Johnny who need help from getting it.
Overall spending on healthcare has doubled over the past 2 decades, reaching $8.5 trillion in 2019, which comes out to 9.8% of global GDP.
It's hard to imagine what may have become of Johnny if any intervention had taken place. Would police have still made a horrific discovery in Pazuzu's backyard in 2015? Or would things with said timely intervention have turned out wildly different? By 18, Johnny was still a freshman in high school, having been held back. He drank unashamedly at school, spoke of committing animal sacrifices, and hardly showered. Teachers turned a blind eye to him and were unsure of how to help him. At home, his mother had remarried, and neighbors claimed that they would often hear violent screaming matches where Johnny would bellow that he hated his stepfather. After finally dropping out of high school, things would begin going rapidly downhill for Johnny, and the relationship between him and his mother became even more complicated. In his early 20s, he demanded that his mother end her relationship with his stepfather, but instead, she would kick him out. But that rift in their relationship would be short-lived, and soon, Cynthia would move hell and earth for her son, even if it meant living in utter filth and hiding horrific, stomach-churning secrets.
I just stood there.
In 2002, John Lawson legally changed his name to Pazuzu Algarad. To many, the name Pazuzu brings up twisted, nightmare-inducing images of the possessed girl in The Exorcist, where a demon of the same name takes control of the main character, Regan. Pazuzu is the name of the ancient Babylonian demon who was in control of the underworld, and Johnny's decision to change his name to this didn't surprise many people who were close to him, and this was for more reasons than one. The second part of his name, Ila Algarad, means the Lord of Locusts, a fitting name for someone set on bringing destruction to the community around him.
You could tell when his demons needed something from him.
As soon as the name change occurred, both Pazuzu's beliefs and behaviors grew more and more extreme. He shaved his head and began to tattoo demonic symbols on himself. His body would become crisscrossed in lines that not only stood out to his community, but scared them. It was clear at this point to those closest to him that Pazuzu wanted to become everything that typical people in a small community feared.
Pazuzu had done everything he could to make himself seem scary to the people in town. He was trying to freak people out.
He began wearing a taqiyya, an Islamic head covering for men, and this was despite him not practicing Islam. It's also important to remember that this was in the rural South just after 9/11, when fear and prejudice against Muslim individuals were at an all-time high.
Muslims and people of Arab and South Asian descent in America also face racial profiling by law enforcement.
By combining Islamic cultural symbols and words with satanic imagery and beliefs, Pazuzu had around this time transformed himself into the antithesis of the community around him. And that choice certainly wasn't by accident. Pazuzu wanted to be seen, and it's possible that upon realizing that he wasn't seen as normal, he decided that he'd take his identity to the polar opposite of the spectrum.
Tattoos that had largely gone unseen to the public, some reading Pazuzu, Lucifer, Satan, Villain, 666, Joker, live fast and die.
While many of the wealthy, polished older people around him showed off bright pearly whites, Pazuzu bizarrely filed his teeth into sharp points. He had no idea that in a few years' time, he would burrow these same teeth into the arteries of his arm in an attempt to escape the fate awaiting him. Pazuzu lived at 2749 Nob Hill, a quaint house that hid more than one dark secret. Almost immediately, Pazuzu began to grow a strange following at his house. He invited people who were struggling with drug addiction, homelessness, as well as job loss, to gather at his home and do as they pleased.
Black metal blaring at ungodly, ear-shattering volumes. There was always glass getting smashed, people fighting.
In a society filled with young and disenfranchised people who were struggling in the aftermath of the 07-08 financial crisis, this place served as a beacon of hope and a much-needed sanctuary for them. But Pazuzu's house, dubbed the House of Horrors, is a kind of sanctuary, quote-unquote, that only people who were truly struggling could endure, or in fact see any sort of merit in stepping foot in.
Dude, your house smells like death. Oh yeah, it's just the bodies in the basement.
Long, ratty-ass dreadlocks, and all his teeth filed down to a point, which later come to find out he did high as hell on meth one day.
The home, if one could even refer to it as that, proved to be as lawless as it was filthy. People would regularly float in and out of the house, abusing substances, breaking furniture, getting in violent altercations, and also using the carpet and closets as a bathroom. By all accounts, the house reeked of urine and feces, and after people defecated on the carpets, it would often be days before it was taken care of. If it was taken care of at all.
Human beings would just pop a squat in a corner, take a crap, and God knows when it would get cleaned up, or the dogs might eat it, or whatever.
Shockingly, his mother lived in the same home, hiding in her own much cleaner quarters, at least in comparison to the rest of the house, seemingly able to disassociate from the horrors and filth taking place just outside her door and down the hall. In spite of the grime, there was a staggering number of young women who also flocked to Pazuzu's house. Many people suspect that Pazuzu targeted young women and subtly manipulated them over time, increasing his demands and control over them, much like Charles Manson would, who he also reportedly happened to be a big fan of. Orgies were supposedly commonplace, and one of Pazuzu's followers even claimed that they were casually shown footage of sexual acts taking place between several people at the home.
The video was of Pazuzu and Bubbles dancing around naked, Bubbles lying on a bed in one scene, doing inappropriate things to herself.
There was people naked like it was nothing. He tried to have orgies and trying to manipulate people into having sex and doing whatever they wanted to do.
You know, it's like this mad place where you can act out your darkest and sickest fantasies to no judgment.
Claiming to be the gatekeeper of hell, Pazuzu, in an attempt to prove it, went to extreme lengths. Every new moon, he would sacrifice an animal as part of a ritual, and followers claimed that Pazuzu would drink blood from birds that he killed, and also claimed that at one point during a sacrifice, early in his self-proclaimed rule as a demonic god, strung a cat from a tree. But how could a man who was clearly teething on the edge of insanity amass a following that supported his killing of innocent animals, drinking blood, and ruthlessly trashing his own house? People close to Pazuzu claimed that he had some sort of magnetic allure about him.
The idea that you can go somewhere judgment-free with no pressure on you, somebody's gonna give you drugs and let you behave however you want, there's an appeal to that.
But that perceived magnetism may in hindsight simply come down to the most basic human needs and desires. Several people who joined Pazuzu were involved with drugs and had been rejected by their families. They had no place to eat, sleep, no one to talk to, and really no one to help them get the substances that they so desperately craved for an escape. They were outcasts who didn't belong in the tight-knit Christian town that they were raised in, and they had nowhere else to go and no one who wanted them. But Pazuzu did want them. In fact, he needed them for his own ego just as much as they needed him for shelter, support, and substances. Many of the people that he once again targeted were facing a bleak world fresh out of high school, and the idea of someone wanting them, especially a very popular and powerful man like Pazuzu, had an irresistible appeal for them. And this appeal and desperation is exactly why it took so long for Pazuzu's horrific crimes to come to light. And this was in spite of him openly bragging to his followers about the murders that he committed. July of 2009 was the last time that Stacy saw her ex-partner and father of her child, 37-year-old Joshua Wetzler. Despite the recession killing their romantic relationship, Joshua was still known as a loving father, and Stacy still cared for him deeply. She had no idea that a cookout near the ranch they'd both dreamt of owning together would be the very last time she would see his smile or hear his laugh.
Then when she got pregnant, they settled down, bought a small farm that they were going to turn into a horse farm, got screwed by a bank right before all the loan companies and everything start to fail, and Josh's life starts going downhill there.
Little is known about how exactly Josh knew Pazuzu or disappeared at his hands. At the time, Josh was allegedly selling substances to support him and his family, which may have been the only link between him and Pazuzu.
His wife leaves him because he got desperate and he started thinking about selling drugs. I mean, it was pretty benign stuff like weed and mushrooms, but his wife didn't want a child around that sort of thing. She had to leave.
Josh was a man who had been on the right side of the law for years of his life. But after him and Stacy lost their house and after he lost his job, he felt he had no choice but to sell substances to make a living. Soon after Josh disappeared from the face of the earth, Pazuzu drunkenly stood before his followers. He proudly told anyone who would listen that he had a man trapped in his basement and that they were not to let him out. Some followers claimed that Pazuzu tortured and starved the man in his basement for days before he killed him, and they also mentioned that he cut off all of his appendages. He bragged that he covered the body of the man in cat litter and bleach in order to cover up the stench, and bizarrely, despite all these gruesome details that he shared with them, he would give his followers no explanation of why he did this, nor did they even ask. All they did know was that he claimed to violently murder a man and that he was proudly wearing that man's blood-stained bandana around his head for days. That bandana belonged to Joshua Wetzler.
It was Josh's bandana, from what I was told by everyone that hung out with him. They had trapped him in a basement, and they had starved him for days. They cut off his extremities, his arms and his legs and his penis, and they buried him in pieces.
On August 3rd, 2009, Tarina Billings, Pazuzu's neighbor, nervously made her way to the sheriff's office after a heartbreaking encounter. Several nights earlier, Pazuzu showed up to her house frantic and begged Tarina's father to come help him with something. When her father returned later under the cover of night, blanketed in dirt from head to toe, Tarina's heart sank. At a party in early August, Pazuzu had killed someone and buried him in his backyard, and laughed about it with no remorse.
It was very hard to go to the police, but I thought, what if that was my brother buried in somebody's backyard? I would want somebody to come forward and say something.
Tarina was undoubtedly brave to speak to the police, a hero even, which only made law enforcement's reaction that much more heartbreaking. Officers rushed Tarina out of the office, unconcerned, and nonchalantly telling her that they would follow up on her lead. Their follow-up consisted of reporting to Pazuzu's house, asking him if he had a body buried in the backyard, and then leaving after Pazuzu told him that he didn't. A month later, an anonymous caller contacted dispatch to report that a man had been shot and buried in Pazuzu's backyard. And bizarrely, once again, the police would not conduct a proper search. And the fact that it's possible that if a search had been conducted or pressure had been put on Pazuzu during this time, the next tragedy that was yet to occur would perhaps never have had a chance to happen, and that one more person would still be alive and with his family. It was October of 2009 when Tommy Dean Welch left his house for a walk. He was planning to get pizza and watch a movie with his mother later that night after his nieces and nephews fell asleep. But Tommy never returned home. Instantly, his family knew that something was deeply wrong, but little did they know just how wrong things truly were. Even in their states of anxiety, with their minds racing and their stomachs churning, they couldn't possibly imagine what really happened to Tommy. And this was primarily because to this day, it still doesn't make sense to anyone involved in the case. It's believed that during his walk to get pizza, Tommy encountered Pazuzu and his followers. And after that, he vanished, only to be found 5 years later in a place that no one would expect. Sylvia LaBelle, a Clemens local, was not the type of person that you'd expect to be involved with the twisted, horrific life of Pazuzu Algarad. And yet, she too found herself weakly intertwined with it, giving Pazuzu and his friends rides and occasionally sitting inside his house at parties. And at one of the aforementioned parties, she too was present when Pazuzu mentioned that he killed someone named Josh. Disturbed, she told this to one of her own friends on a drive home one night, completely unaware that her friend was also a close friend of Josh's ex, Stacy. Upon learning about who Josh was and how Stacy was mourning, Sylvia and Stacy's unnamed friend knew that they had to do something. Their hearts ached not just for the injustice that had been done, but also the suffering that they saw Stacy enduring. So they took matters into their own hands. Now, because of a previous charge, Sylvia didn't think that she would be taken seriously by police without evidence, and so she chose to step foot into the lion's den, if you will, in order to get the answers herself. Using a hidden recorder, she went to Pazuzu's house and asked his followers if Pazuzu had actually killed anyone. And bizarrely, the followers, while laughing, told her that he had, disclosing details about Josh's killing, unaware that they were on tape the whole time.
So we concocted the plan that I would get a voice recording of information on how Josh died or was murdered. I went with my phone to record any information I could. There were several people that spoke up on the voice recording, but the main voice was Nate. I started laughing and said, "Is it true that Pazuzu actually killed people?" And Nate looked at me and said, "Well, yeah, like it was common knowledge. He'd killed people."
With evidence finally in hand, Sylvia then went to the police with a recording. She felt that Pazuzu, as well as all the damage that he'd caused to the community of Clemens, would finally be stopped and that they would be at last free from his terrifying, not to mention unsettling rule. But despite the evidence presented, police didn't take her seriously.
I know I looked crazy, but they didn't take anything I said seriously.
To be quite frank, it's unknown why this is, but speculatively, it could potentially be because Sylvia's recording could be used in court against them. This is because the conversation was recorded without the other party's consent. Now, on the other hand, it could also be because law enforcement simply didn't believe Sylvia, or that they didn't want to investigate the satanic cult that they'd heard so many whispers and rumors about. With her tail between her legs at this point, Sylvia then went to the horse farm that Stacy was working on. There were beautiful rolling green hills that stretched into the horizon, and horses that trotted and rolled in the sunshine, unaware, of course, of the horrors that were swirling in Sylvia's mind. When Sylvia saw Josh's son running through the grass of the farm, her heart shattered. That little boy deserved answers about his father, and Stacy, who had worked so hard for answers, deserved justice.
So many emotions ran through my mind when I saw him, thinking, oh my God, his dad was murdered by this guy that I happen to know.
It was at this point that finally, Stacy would go to the police.
And I went to the police and I told him, I said, you're gonna think I'm crazy, but I think my son's father is buried in, this guy's backyard in Clemens.
With her clean record, police finally took Josh's disappearance and the claim that he was buried on Pazuzu's compound more seriously.
We executed a search warrant at 2749 Nob Hill Drive in Clemens, North Carolina.
In February of 2010, after numerous calls, in-person visits, and even a confessional recording, law enforcement finally searched Pazuzu's property. What did they find? Nothing. Reportedly, law enforcement did not have the ground-penetrating radar necessary to locate a buried body, and not to mention cadaver dogs didn't hit on the house. Pazuzu and his followers remained free, though of course neither he, or as a matter of fact them, were free of guilt.
I really did not know what to think because I was so sure that Josh was there in Pazuzu's yard. When they didn't find him, I wasn't sure anymore what had happened.
A few months later, yet another murder would take place. 30-year-old Joseph Chandler was coerced to join Pazuzu and one of his followers, 20-year-old Nicholas Rizzi, in their car. They arrived at a local park and found themselves standing at the edge of the lake. What happened there is still a mystery to this day, but a few shocking facts are known. Nicholas pulled a gun and raised it behind Joseph's head. After it failed to fire, he hurried to the car where he would retrieve yet another gun. Unaware of what was about to happen, Joseph then lit a cigarette and gazed out over the moon-soaked lake, and before he could take a drag, he was shot in the head.
30-year-old Joseph Emmerich Chandler was found shot dead by the Yadkin River. Pazuzu, then 31, was charged with accessory after the fact of involuntary manslaughter, with Yadkin County deputies claiming Pazuzu had assisted Nicholas Rizzi, who was charged with involuntary manslaughter in connection, in his attempt to escape arrest.
Nicholas was quickly linked to the crime. After claiming that he shot Joseph in self-defense, he'd be jailed for 13 months for involuntary manslaughter. Pazuzu, on the other hand, was only charged as an accessory after the fact of involuntary manslaughter and received nothing but probation for his actions. Leading up to the trial, Pazuzu would be forced to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and it was during this evaluation that Pazuzu would reveal extremely dark and disturbing details about himself. He said that he only bathed about once a year, and this was because he believed that his stench and filth protected him against disease. And after attempting to dive deep into his religious beliefs to see if there were any delusions involved, he would then reveal to authorities that he practiced a Sumerian religion that he made up himself.
Pazuzu. He claimed to be able to control the weather. He became Winston-Salem's own masculinist icon of depravity.
He claimed that he learned the rites and beliefs while going through a 5-year shamanistic journey. After stating this, he'd then anxiously tell medical staff that he had to leave to perform a ritual under the black moon, as he did every month. When the staff spoke to Pazuzu's mother, she bizarrely echoed his concerns, shamelessly telling the medical professionals that her son's ritual involved killing a small animal, and that if he didn't go through with the plan, she feared he may end his own life. Despite the insanity of Pazuzu's psychiatric evaluation, his diagnosis was rather simple: panic disorder with agoraphobia, alcohol dependence, and possible schizotypal personality disorder.
Psychiatrist Dr. Phil Levine says Pazuzu's schizotypal personality disorder would have led him to experience unusual perceptual experiences, odd thinking or speech, to be suspicious.
He had alcohol problems for a long time, and then he started getting into methamphetamines, which is not likely to help him, but to make his anxiety issues worse.
Adding he wouldn't have responded well to medications.
Schizotypal personality disorder involves magical thinking, strange beliefs, detachment from reality, and trouble in social relationships. But it does not involve hallucinations or delusions. Both conditions, however, can involve a break from reality. But the difference is that schizophrenia is marked by a prolonged disconnection from reality that takes place over at least a month-long period and makes it extremely challenging for those with the disorder to function or speak with others. In Pazuzu's case, he was able to interact cooperatively with the law system as well as with the people at the mental health facility where he was held. Still, he displayed symptoms of odd beliefs, paranoia, as well as strange speech patterns, all of which are hallmarks of schizotypal personality disorder. After his brush with incarceration, things began to spiral for Pazuzu. Perhaps it was the pressure of the pending charges against him, or maybe it was his fear of the truth being found out. But despite these fears of his, the violence on Nob Hill escalated. In May of 2010, Pazuzu would be arrested for choking his mother Cynthia until she couldn't breathe. Later, Cynthia redacted the charges, unwilling to pursue a lawsuit against her own son. It wasn't until 2014 that the law would finally look in Pazuzu's direction again. By then, he had grown his following and found himself in a polyamorous relationship with not just one, but 3 young girls who he called his fiancées, all of whom were under the age of 25. These women, Dixie, Amber Birch, and Crystal Matlock, had not only witnessed Pazuzu do horrible things, but some of them had even helped him cover it up. In mid-2014, Matt Flowers found himself standing in the filthy den that Pazuzu and his followers called home. Matt, a war veteran having just returned from the Middle East a few months earlier, reported in interviews that he holds himself to a moral code, like many people in the military do. He claimed that Pazuzu, however, had no morals.
Pazuzu, I just felt like he wasn't going anywhere. He's just kind of shitbag, you know, Pazuzu would call me all the time on the phone. And he wanted to know if I killed anyone in Iraq. I've seen what the world really is like. Nobody's right or wrong in a war. Nobody's good or evil in war. But Pazuzu, he was highly evil.
After assaulting 2 of Matt's female friends, including one that was a veteran herself, Matt became disgusted with Pazuzu and eager to get him behind bars. At a party on one fateful night, Pazuzu berated his mother in front of his guests, threatening her, screaming at her, and calling her horrific names. One of the guests, who remains unnamed, went on to tell Pazuzu off for speaking to his mother in such a tone. In response to this, Pazuzu then pulled Matt into another room and tried to coerce him into murdering the man who had just spoken out against him.
He's like, let's kill him right now. We'll get away with it.
Many reports indicate that Pazuzu rarely did his own dirty work. After all, that's what his followers were for, at least in his eyes. However, Matt was no follower. Instead, after Pazuzu's coercion attempts, he marched to the police station and reported what Pazuzu said to him. And because of the fact that he'd served in the army, he was one of the few people that had come forward who was taken seriously by the police. It was on August 5, 2004 that Forsyth County Sheriff's Office conducted their second search of Pazuzu's property. That being said, this was in fact their first thorough search, and what they found inside was startling. The stench was unbearable. Feral animals ran amok. Satanic sketches were etched into the walls, the pool, the doors, and even the exterior of the house. One room, known as the altar room, was such a biohazard that the fire department had to wear hazmat suits in the room just to search it. And shockingly, it wasn't what officers could see that was the most disturbing part of all this, but in fact what lay beneath their feet. It was beneath the fire pit that law enforcement discovered a body in a shallow grave. The body had seemingly been cut apart and left as nothing but a mound of skeleton, decaying flesh, and ripped clothing. And on the corner of the lot, they discovered another.
The Forsyth County Sheriff's Office announced they'd found the skeletal remains of 2 people in Algarad's backyard.
This is actually where one was buried.
Now, they'd found not just one body, but 2. All the warnings they'd gotten throughout the years, all the calls, all the emails, all the in-person visits, all of them were true. Pazuzu had in fact killed and buried people in his backyard. Pazuzu and his girlfriends Amber Birch and Crystal Matlock were arrested, and soon after, the home was deemed uninhabitable and would be brought to the ground, during which time neighbors celebrated the destruction of the devil's house they'd all come to fear. It wasn't long after their discovery that the bodies would be identified as those of Joshua Wetzler and Tommy Dean Welch, both of whom had gunshot wounds to the head as well as their torsos.
I knew immediately it was Josh. Just such relief. I mean, tears of joy. I just felt like he was out of there. You know, he was free.
In the aftermath of the arrest, little of the truth was revealed, but some shocking details would come to light. Pazuzu had ruthlessly shot Joshua Wetzler in July of 2009. Amber and Crystal were his accomplices in burying the body. In October, Birch was coerced into shooting Tommy Welsh in the back of the head while he sat on Pazuzu's couch. Pazuzu then helped her bury the body.
So I started dating this girl, Dixie. She was intrigued with him and his girlfriend, Amber, and we started going over to his house to hang out. She walked out onto their back porch with me one night and pointed out the backyard. She was like, "Do you ever stop and think why the ground is so uneven out here?"
Meanwhile, Pazuzu's mom, Cynthia, who was present for all the murders, was never charged with any crimes.
Just feet outside the basement, where Algarad's mother, Cynthia James, says Pazuzu had stashed Josh's body.
I heard this pop, 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 pop come out of my room. And I said, "What's going on?" And Josh is laying on the floor, and I'm like, "My God, I don't remember what I'm going crazy."
She asked him to come sit in the den before returning to her bedroom, where she considered her options and chose to do nothing.
So then I came out and I said, "I'm gonna go to work."
Joshua and Tommy had families. They had lives. And for no logical reason, those lives were snatched from them and those who loved them. Crystal was charged with accessory after the fact for first-degree murder for helping bury Wetzler. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit accessory after the fact to second-degree murder and was sentenced to a minimum of 3 years and 10 months in prison. In May 2018, she was released. And Amber, who took a plea deal pleading guilty to second-degree murder and accessory after the fact to murder and robbery with a dangerous weapon, was sentenced to 30 to 40 years in prison, which she's currently still serving. But bizarrely, Pazuzu was never sentenced. While being held in prison, he reportedly used his sharp teeth to bite into an artery and take his own life, and he would thereby be pronounced dead on October 28, 2015, never forced to face the penalties for his brutal crimes. Although this case is a tragic one, fortunately some bright spots have arisen in the sea of darkness and turmoil that Pazuzu created. Joshua Wetzler's ex, Stacy Carter, owns and operates Heart-Centered Horsemanship, an equine training and therapy facility to help people struggling with mental health, addiction, and other issues. Until this day, she carries her love for Josh and their combined love of horses and farming with her everywhere she goes.
My life's work has become about horses and teaching people, giving people that opportunity.
Pazuzu's story and the story of Joshua and Tommy didn't have to end this way. Pazuzu once again displayed extreme social anxiety and agoraphobia as a child. With a lack of intervention due to cost, he never really had a chance to correct those mental health problems welling inside of him. No one in the community reached out to help him, and instead, they ostracized him even further. This is a chronic issue in American society, one that can only be fixed with resources and proper education. In addition, it's also important to once again note that those who flocked to Pazuzu were ostracized as well, and police didn't take them seriously regardless of the multiple tips they had given, which of course led to more people needlessly suffering and dying. This is why mental health intervention should be a priority and not an afterthought. There are no quote-unquote others in our society. There are just people who have either been misled, set aside, and/or are deeply, deeply troubled. The good news is, there are still things that we can do to improve our society, but in order to do so, we must be willing to not only look into the dark, but also confront what hides within it. It's a town forever marred by the most horrific crime in Australian history.
Snowtown seized the attention of the world, and Australia recoiled in horror.
It doesn't get any worse. And if it does, I don't want to see it. Not in my lifetime.
Serial murder, cannibalism, and torture so brutal that the acts committed have been described as a glimpse into hell.
He was burnt with cigarettes, he had his toes crushed with pliers. He even had a lit sparkler forced down the eye of the penis, and he was restrained as it burned down towards his own flesh.
The Snowtown Murders are a tragic series of events that have drawn global attention for over 20 years. And yet, to this day, people still struggle to comprehend the horrors of what was discovered there.
All of the barrels were full of body parts. The difficulty was, how many bodies did we have there?
The following details the horrifying realities of the Snowtown Murders, more infamously known as bodies in barrels. It was May of 1999, and as the beautiful sunset painted the South Australian skies with a warm orange hue, 24-year-old David Johnson was ecstatically gazing over these countryside wheat fields from inside a car. His stepbrother, James Vlasakis, sat behind the wheel with a smile on his face and a mobile phone to his ear. "This is the voice of happiness. We're on our way," he told a man on the other end of the line. James had found a used computer for sale in the rural town of Snowtown and offered to join David as he set out to buy it. David was obsessed with computers, so getting one for just $200 was an offer too good to pass up, even if it meant a long drive. Besides, he was happy to spend time with his younger brother. The two pulled into the dilapidated downtown of Snowtown and turned toward an old abandoned bank building. The seller had directed them to go here, and as excited as David was to get the computer, he noticed that there was something very blatantly off about the place. When they stepped inside, they would quickly realize that there was no computer. In fact, there had never been one. Instead, this was a setup. David entered the building first, and upon doing so, was knocked to the ground in an instant. Two attackers then wrangled handcuffs and thumb cuffs on him. They taunted and threatened him as they searched his body for his wallet. After demanding his PIN, the assailants then began to torture him with pliers, lit cigarettes, and their own fists. And although the ambush came as a shock, what stunned David the most was the fact that he knew the perpetrators. Standing before him and delighting in his pain were John Bunting and Robert Wagner, both of who were family friends of his for several years. And tragically, they weren't the only ones betraying him.
To think that Jamie, who had lived with me for so long, could actually kill my son David, my lovely son David.
His own stepbrother James had orchestrated the entire attack. He knew that David had money, and he had every intention of robbing him of as much of it as he could. After receiving David's PIN, he and Wagner left to visit a bank in a nearby town to withdraw as much money as possible. In their absence, Bunting forced David to record a series of messages. He was ordered to repeat phrases after them, such as "leave me alone" and "why are you phoning me?" It was at this point that David likely realized he wasn't leaving alive. If anyone called him, this series of clips would be used to try and explain away his disappearance. When James and Wagner returned, David was already dead. Bunting had tortured him at length, burning cigarettes on him, as mentioned before, striking him, and electrocuting him with a crude tool. And when David attempted to escape, Bunting choked him with a belt. But even after that, Bunting wasn't finished.
And Robert Wagner and John Bunting removed a portion of his flesh in the bank vault at Snowtown and took it across the road in a plastic glove to their friend's house and told him that they had some roo meat to cook. And they fried this piece of flesh in a fry pan on the stove and cut it up and served it not only to themselves but also this friend of theirs. And he ate it and they ate it, and it was a disturbing moment, but the friend didn't know what it was.
Bunting ordered James to tell everyone that David had gotten a 13-year-old girl pregnant and thereafter fled to hide from police. And after conspiring to murder his brother and eating him, he would also find that lying about his whereabouts came easily. But how did a group this twisted ever come to be? It all started here. John Bunting moved into this house in early 1991. He was 24 years old and had already lived a stranger life than most. Growing up in Inala, Queensland, it was clear to John's neighbors, friends, and schoolmates that there was something very strange about him. Despite having devoted parents, he would quickly develop a number of concerning behaviors.
But he showed some really concerning traits as a child from very early on, and one of those was the pleasure he used to take in killing things. It started with insects, and as he got older, there were some early signs that this was a fella who was definitely not right.
Many have theorized that this need for destruction and anger came from an earlier childhood experience that allegedly occurred when John was around 8 years old.
He also suffered a horrible moment of sexual abuse at the hands of a brother's friend. where he was sexually assaulted, or so he would tell years later. And I think that that had a significant impact on him as well.
It's important to note that when it comes to psychology, for instance, experiencing abuse at a young age can cause a wide range of symptoms, including a tendency towards violence and criminal behavior. True to these findings, Bunting not only became a violent criminal, but also developed a strange obsession that followed him for the rest of his life.
It just seemed as if the sun rose and the sun set on pedophilias. That was virtually all he would discuss.
Bunting was fixated on pedophiles, as well as people that he deemed useless in society. He referred to pedophiles, LGBTQ individuals, addicts, prostitutes, and even just people who annoyed him as dirties, and frequently told those around him that dirties didn't deserve to live. On the wall in his home, he had what he referred to as a spider wall, pictures making up a web of people that he claimed were pedophiles. Not only was that web extensive, but it's important to note that it was also not at all based in reality.
He believes when he walks down the street that he can just see someone and know they're a child molester.
As soon as Bunting moved to the home in Salisbury North, he would find a like-minded companion in Robert Wagner, who would eventually also become his close friend and henchman. The summer of 1992 is when the two committed an act that would forever link them. Clinton Tresize was in the wrong place at the wrong time. At just 22 years old, he became acquainted with Wagner and Bunting. He had previously had a relationship with a man named Barry Lane, who was also in a relationship with Wagner when Bunting moved to Salisbury North. Clinton was young, bright, and full of life, and had just struck out on his own.
He still had a vulnerability about him. I remember when he got the unit on Phillip Highway, he was ecstatic. He was so excited to be living on his own.
But evidently, Bunting saw him as a threat. Clinton was a known homosexual, but Bunting began to claim that he was a pedophile as well. It's important to note that there is no proof of this once again, and that over the years Bunting would claim this about dozens of innocent people. Bunting repeatedly told anyone that would listen that Clinton didn't deserve to live, and on August 31st, he decided to turn that twisted belief into action. Bunting invited Clinton over for a visit, and almost immediately after he arrived and sat on the couch, Bunting would launch an attack, accusing him of being a pedophile and bashing Clinton in the back of the head. Little is known about just what happened during the senseless attack that Clinton faced, which only makes it harder for his family to cope.
I hope to God he died instantly, but I don't know if he did or whether he just went unconscious. All I can picture is my innocent brother sitting on a couch, such a moron coming up and going whack on the back of his head.
Clinton was buried in a shallow grave in Lower Light, South Australia. Bunting, Wagner, and Barry Lane reportedly all worked together to bury his body. It wouldn't be until 1994 that Clinton's body was found, and not long after that, Bunting went on to seek his next victim. On what was meant to be a day for celebration, 47-year-old Suzanne Allen instead found her world falling apart. Her ex-boyfriend, Ray Davies, who was 21 years her junior, was staying in a caravan in her backyard after an amicable breakup. The two were on good terms. That is until December 26th. Following a day of festivities, Suzanne's grandson sheepishly admitted to her that Davies had assaulted him on Christmas Day, and a twisted series of events were set into motion. Suzanne told Bunting about the assault, then hurried to the police with her daughter to report it. By the time that they returned home, Davies was gone. Bunting, Wagner, and Lane were spotted emptying Davies' caravan. In a much later testimony, witnesses would reveal that Bunting and his wife, Elizabeth Harvey, visited Davies the day after Christmas, during which Wagner admittedly tagged along to take part in the crimes that followed. Bunting claims that Elizabeth stabbed Davies in the leg. From there, the testimonies become muddled. Witnesses claim that Davies was tortured at a property in Bakara, about 90 minutes from Suzanne's home, then returned to Bunting's house where he was killed. At some points, however, the same witnesses claimed that Davies had been killed at a home in Baccara. Regardless, some of the testimonies still remain the same. Wagner was asphyxiated with jumper cables, his genitals were bashed in with a metal pole, and he was then buried on Bunting's property beneath a mix of bricks, concrete, and soil. Suzanne no longer had Davies living in her backyard. She did, however, have another problem. She had a crush on Bunting, which ended about as well as you would expect. Suzanne Allen's death is shrouded in the most mystery out of any victim tied to the Snowtown murders. After the death of Ray Davies, Suzanne allegedly became infatuated with Bunting, which he soon grew tired of. And as their relationship deteriorated, it's theorized that Bunting murdered her to collect her pension and prevent her from speaking about the murder of Ray Davies. Theorized, unfortunately, is a key word here. Bunting would later tell investigators that Suzanne died of natural causes, supposedly a heart attack, after which he merely disposed of her for financial gain. But it's how he disposed of her body that is the most condemning action of all. In 1999, Suzanne's body was found buried in the backyard of Bunting's infamous home. She had been dismembered, defleshed, and put into 11 separate plastic bags. In 2 of the bags, lengths of rope were discovered. The bags containing her body parts were placed above the body of Ray Davies. Suzanne was the 3rd person to go missing around Bunting, Wagner, and their close friend Mark Hayden. But she would be far from the last. 19-year-old Michael Gardner had struggled for most of their life. Openly homosexual and struggling with their gender identity, they often went by the name Michelle, a dangerous act of bravery in the 1990s. When they moved in with Nicole Zaretta soon after graduating high school, they found that they were in a place where they felt they belonged for the very first time.
Yeah, he was an absolute delight. Very, very happy young man. And I do think that it was the environment that allowed him to be himself that enabled him to feel a little bit free to express himself and not be judged.
But there was a catch. Nicole Zaretta was close with Wagner's family. She was Wagner's wife's cousin, leading her and Michael to spend quality time with the Wagners as well as Bunting. Bunting detested Michael from the start. He openly called Michael, quote-unquote, the biggest homo, as well as several other slurs. He repeatedly talked about how soon Michael would get what he deserved as a dirty. In September of 1998, Michael was innocently playing tag with Wagner's children. When Michael playfully grabbed one of his kids, Wagner became blinded by rage. That was all that Bunting and Wagner needed to enact their next evil plan. The two would kidnap Michael and drag him to a shed in Murray Bridge, South Australia. They then tortured him at length, tied a rope around Michael's neck, and strangled them. And every time they collapsed from a lack of oxygen and exhaustion, Wagner and Bunting would force Michael to stand. After killing Michael, Bunting stuffed them into a barrel full of acid that was kept in the shed for several months. Michael's foot had to be dismembered so their body could fit inside. Eventually, that drum would be moved to an infamous location. But in the meantime, Bunting and Wagner had to cover up their crime. They ransacked Nicole Zaretta's home and stole several items, staging it to look as though Michael robbed Nicole and skipped town. Even long after, they kept up the lie.
He was a pedophile, he was a predator, he had no redeeming features.
The next murder, only a month after Michael's brutal killing, was the first time that Bunting and Wagner would turn on one of their very own. And once again, it would be far from the last. 42-year-old Barry Lane did not have a good reputation in Adelaide. Despite being a predator, Barry Lane had been romantically involved with Wagner and close friends with Bunting, which Bunting would later claim was for good reason. Bunting utilized Lane's connections to keep tabs on the local pedophiles. He tracked them on his aforementioned spider wall and planned attacks strategically based on the information that Lane gave him. Lane had helped dispose the body of the first victim, Clinton Tresize, and was reportedly traumatized by it. But it was another young man who would lead to Lane's ultimate demise. 18-year-old Thomas Trevelyan moved in with Lane in early 1997 and would thereafter become acquainted with Wagner, Bunting, and Hayden. When Thomas confessed to Bunting that Lane had been sexually assaulting him, Bunting took action. Thomas, Wagner, and Bunting forced Lane to call his mother. Upon doing so, he would berate her with names, egged on by Thomas in the background, and also told her that he was moving to Queensland and would never talk to her again. That last part was true. This was in fact the final time that Barry Lane's mother ever heard from him. Just moments later, Lane was being brutally tortured. His toes were crushed and removed with pliers, after which Bunting, Wagner, and Thomas proceeded to force Lane to give them his bank information, just like they'd done with David, before strangling him, wrapping him in carpet, and stuffing him in a barrel. After Bunting happily drove Lane's car and collected his pension payments, the group had made out well from the murder. Well, that is, everyone except for Thomas Trevelyan. Thomas had taken part in the murder of Barry Lane, and perhaps due to this, it goes without saying that he was a very, very sick man. Yet, Thomas's sickness was quite different and unique from Bunting, Wagner, and also Hayden. Thomas suffered from debilitating schizophrenia. Sometimes he believed that he was in the army, so he'd wear fatigues everywhere. Other times, he thought that animals, invisible beings, and people were out to end his life. On November 5th, 1997, however, he would unfortunately be right about someone being out to kill him. Thomas's mental health took a drastic turn after the murder of Barry Lane. Following an incident where he chased a dog with a knife, Bunting and Wagner determined that he was too much of a liability to keep alive, and felt like they couldn't trust him to keep a secret or to lay low. To solve their problem, they took an unsuspecting Thomas to Humbug Scrub, a beautifully rural area just outside of Adelaide. There, they forced Thomas to stand on a box and put a noose around his neck, after which they would kick the box out from under him. The following morning, Thomas's body was discovered still hanging from the tree. Due to his turbulent mental health and history of self-harm, police quickly determined that Thomas had taken his own life. The murderous gang had now managed to escape the eye of the law for several murders. And this wasn't because they were particularly cunning or careful. Sadly, it's because they targeted at-risk individuals, people who were mentally ill, the lonely, the poor, the unprivileged, as well as the ostracized. All people who could potentially go missing without any concern from the police. 29-year-old Gavin Porter was no different. Gavin Porter suffered from schizophrenia at a time when getting help for something like this was nearly impossible. Due to the severity of his symptoms, he turned to drugs and alcohol to navigate his life, and the aforementioned James Vlasakis, who had been living with Bunting since he was 14, was close friends with Porter and offered him a place to stay. But quickly, Bunting determined that Porter was a waste of space, and after an instance where he was pricked by a needle that Porter had lost in the couch cushion, Bunting became enraged. That night, Bunting and Wagner snuck over to Porter's car in the backyard where he was sleeping and began to strangle him. During this time, Porter was startled awake and began to fight back, but of course, he was no match against two men. James Vlasakis returned home later that night, upon which Bunting led him to the shed in the backyard where Porter's dead body lay on the ground, his neck discolored from the strangulation he endured. After years of being essentially raised by Bunting, James was surprised but accepting. He had yet to take part in a murder. But by September of 1998, this too changed. It was the early morning hours when James was shaken awake by Bunting. With a cheeky grin, Bunting and Wagner told James that they were going to murder Troy Yude. Troy wasn't a stranger. In fact, he was family. James was Troy's half-brother. On multiple occasions, James told Bunting that Troy assaulted him when he was a child. Now, Bunting told James, was the time to get his revenge. It should be noted just as before that There is no proof, aside from James's word, that Troy ever touched him. Regardless, Troy was dragged from his bed in the dead of night and forced into a bathtub. There, a nightmare awaited him.
He endured horrific acts of torture, burns, toes crushed with pliers, and was eventually murdered in there.
Bunting, Wagner, and James tortured Troy until he revealed his bank account information and agreed to record messages stating that he was moving away. Though Troy was accused of what Bunting considered the highest crime, which was being a pedophile, he was still not the person who was subjected to the most heinous torture. Unfortunately, that was 18-year-old Fred Brooks. Fred Brooks was on cloud 9 soon after his high school graduation. The confident young man had been accepted into the Australian Air Force Cadets and, being so young, had his whole future ahead of him. Tragically, Bunting, Wagner, Hayden, and James changed that. Fred lived with the Haydens and had met Bunting and Wagner several times. For unknown reasons, Bunting went on to become obsessed with the teen. He told anyone that would listen that Brooks was a dirty and a pedophile. After hearing that he had been accepted to the Air Force, Bunting invited Fred to a party with the group. Once he had Fred at his house, he told James that he had some goodies that he wanted to share. Bunting tricked Fred into a pair of handcuffs and thumb cuffs. As soon as he was restrained, he began to attack him. What Fred endured next is nothing short of pure hell.
He endured unspeakable acts of torture before he was finally murdered. He was burnt with cigarettes, he had his toes crushed with pliers, he even had a lit sparkler forced down the eye of the penis, and he was restrained as it burned down towards his own flesh. It was a truly horrific, enduring moment of torture. And so when he was finally murdered, it was probably some point of relief for a young man who must have known that he was going to die.
During the attack, Fred was electrocuted and his testicles were injected with bleach until they doubled in size. Despite this, Bunting reportedly told his group that Fred was a good one. He didn't scream during the torture. Fred choked to death on his gag as the men looked on, pleased by his pain. An innocent boy on the cusp of adulthood would have his life snatched from him in the most brutal way by a murderous and not to mention psychotic gang. Fortunately, that gang would soon make all the wrong choices. 29-year-old Gary O'Dwyer lived alone in a small home down the road from Bunting. Physically and intellectually disabled, Bunting saw him as an easy financial target. He ordered James to get close to O'Dwyer to ensure that he had no family or friends who would immediately miss him. When it was confirmed that he'd be alone and isolated, Bunting paid him a visit under the guise of drinking and hanging out for the night. As soon as O'Dwyer had a few drinks, Bunting, Wagner, and James attacked him. He was restrained in handcuffs, pinned down, and tortured with pliers and electric shock. His body was then placed in a barrel and picked up by Hayden, who then concealed it on his property for several days. Hayden had been a satellite member of the gang, eager to talk about the murders, help conceal them, and even bury and dismember the victims. But in late 1998, he became involved in a brand new, horrific kind of way. Elizabeth Hayden had been enjoying a night to herself when she'd heard a knock at the door. Bunting and Wagner greeted her with a smile and entered the home, and this was despite her warning them that her husband Mark wasn't home. Elizabeth had been close with Wagner and Bunting for many years, and this was of course because of their close friendship with Mark. But there was a problem. Many problems, actually. Firstly, Elizabeth knew too much. Mark had told her about the murders. Secondly, Bunting had determined that Elizabeth too was a dirty, and this was because her personality frustrated him. Third, her husband had fallen out of love with her. Upon forcing their way into the home, Bunting and Wagner choked Elizabeth and dragged her into the bathroom. There, she was brutally tortured and killed. But with Elizabeth's murder, Bunting and Wagner had finally made a big enough mistake for law enforcement to look their way. People missed Elizabeth and were looking for her. and although her husband claimed that she had run off with another man, her friends and loved ones knew better. When neighbors saw strange behavior in the driveway, they let the police know.
The witness account described Bunting and Wagner loading garbage bags into a four-wheel drive at about the time she disappeared.
Elizabeth's car disappeared with Bunting and Wagner. Where had it gone? To one of the most infamous towns in the world. By 1999, Bunting's gang had left a trail of carnage, the likes of which Australia had never seen. They needed a place to put the bodies, and this abandoned bank in Snowtown is where they found it. Inside, they disposed of several of their victims in barrels of acid and left them to rot. Mark Hayden, James, Wagner, and Bunting all worked together to keep the bodies hidden here. The townspeople knew that something was deeply wrong. The town had a foul stench in its dry air. Yet the townsfolk didn't know where it came from.
Rotten meat. Some nights you'd pull up in the driveway and you could just about vomit. The stink was so bad.
In May of 1999, police had their eyes on Bunting, Wagner, as well as Hayden and James. And while investigating Elizabeth's disappearance, they would discover that the men had been withdrawing money from bank accounts belonging to several missing people. When they also learned that the group had been visiting Snowtown frequently, they decided to pay it a visit of their own. What they discovered inside the bank would change their lives forever. Upon peeling back a layer of plastic around the doorway and entering the strange space, knives, handcuffs, saws, and other out-of-place tools littered the ground and counters. In the center of the room were dozens of barrels.
When I took the lid off the first barrel, I could see what appeared to be a mummified foot.
And inside these barrels were 8 bodies in various stages of decomposition. Australian law enforcement had never seen a crime of this magnitude. The bodies were eventually determined to belong to Elizabeth Hayden, Michael Gardner, Barry Lane, Gavin Porter, Troy Yude, Fred Brooks, Gary O'Dwyer, and David Johnson. John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Vlasakis, as well as Mark Hayden, were arrested almost immediately. James quickly confessed to the police and gave them a 1,000-page statement about all the murders and his interactions with Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden. The trial became the media storm of the century. Adelaide was forced to construct a new, bigger courthouse solely to allow for proper coverage and analysis of this particular case. Ultimately, James Vlasakis confessed to taking part in 4 of the murders and was sentenced to 4 life sentences, though he is eligible for parole after 26 years. Bunting was convicted of 11 murders, excluding Suzanne Allen, who police ultimately couldn't prove was murdered. He was sentenced to 11 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Wagner was convicted of 10 murders and received 10 consecutive terms of life in prison. Despite the horrors of their crimes, neither Bunting nor Wagner expressed any remorse for what they'd done. At trial, Bunting sat nonchalantly in the courtroom, reading from a book, and even smiling at times. And Wagner was quoted telling police that pedophiles were doing terrible things to children, and the authorities didn't do anything about it, so I took that action. Thank you. And Hayden was sentenced to just 25 years in prison, and bizarrely, due to good behavior, he was released in February of 2024, much to the anger of the families of the victims. Today, Snowtown remains a shell of its former self. There is a stigma associated with it, and many even avoid visiting it because of the grim association that it carries. Perhaps someday, this town can become more than just the site of a horrendous crime. But for now, the pain seems to be far too fresh.
We've got a special recipe for you today, folks. For starters, here are the ingredients that you're gonna need. 1 tablespoon salt, 1 small onion, quartered, 1 garlic clove, 1 bay leaf, 6 peppercorns, and the most important ingredient of all, 1 human head with the tongue. Step 1. Cleave the head into quarters. Step 2. Remove the brains, teeth, nose, and eyes, but be sure to retain the ears. Step 3. Cover the head with fresh, cold water, add salt, bring to a boil, and skim. Cover and simmer for 1 hour. And finally, Step 4. Add the remaining ingredients and continue cooking until the flesh separates from the bone. After that, bon appetit!
What you've just heard is a recipe from the only cookbook written by an actual cannibal. This recipe, titled Ed Gein's Head Cheese, leaves little to imagination. Much like its creator, convicted murderer and cannibal, Nico Clow.
I tried to cut a head once, but I didn't have the right tools, so I came back later and it was too deteriorated.
What would be fun would be using human people in the same kind of industry. Like imagine having slaughterhouses with people, you would hang them from hooks, use an electric gun on them and...
Are you sure this isn't going to get us banned from YouTube?
The few bits of flesh that I was able to actually cut from the cadavers, I tried to, fry them and eat them with different kinds of side things, different condiments. I don't know, it acted on me like a drug. There was this feeling of guilt, but also I felt a weird feeling of actually having done something that was against the natural order.
Nico Clow was standing in front of his dead grandfather, and he believed that it was his fault. At just 10 years old, it was this experience that formed Nico's obsession with not just death, but dead bodies. At the time, no one could have known that that obsession would spiral into consuming meat from cadavers, drinking blood meant for hospital patients, or robbing graves in the dead of night. But at that family outing in 1982, something clicked for Nico. He'd convinced his ill grandfather to play badminton with him. During the game, his grandfather suffered from a cerebral embolism and collapsed to the grass, dying in front of young Nico. According to him, his family's reaction was even more traumatizing.
Well, the family more or less blamed me on that because we were playing a badminton game and it just collapsed during the game. So they kind of blamed me on the fact that I insisted on playing the game when he was not feeling well. And they kind of accused me of his death. And we all went to the funeral wake, and this is when it was the first time when I saw an actual dead person, and also the first time when I entered the funeral home, and I was just fascinated by the atmosphere.
Nico did not have a normal childhood by any means. A French citizen born in Cameroon in 1972, he traveled around frequently, which made it challenging to make friends. His father worked for international banks, which meant they were often on contract in a country for only about 2 years before they'd move on. As an only child, Nico felt incredibly isolated.
Moving all the time made it much harder to interactions with other kids and to establish trust and friendships. So yes, it was definitely harder as a kid to have basic interactions with kids my age. So I was very introvert when I was a kid, and I built my own little fantasy world in which I lived.
And that little fantasy world is where Nico has continued to live for the rest of his life. By the time he was a preteen, he was sneaking into graveyards and became mystified by what he describes as an energy that he felt inside him. With few friends and no siblings, he felt more at home there than anywhere else.
I used to go to graveyards quite a lot. I would teach school and go to graveyards. and I would just walk among the tombs and try to look inside the bigger mausoleums, because they had small windows where you could actually have a look inside the crypt.
After managing to pry open the rusty locks on the mausoleums, Nico gradually progressed to cracking open coffins and crypts to see the bodies inside. The very first cadaver he saw was just bones. A skeleton resting in an eternal slumber with a peeping Tom peering through their casket. When he was eventually arrested by authorities, Nico described his first experience with the skeleton. Allegedly, it was the corpse of a woman who was a Russian immigrant from the early 1900s. He described her as half-rotten, covered in a sheet. Her face was smeared with what he described as death fluids oozing out of her skin. As he lifted the white cloth to stare into her dark, empty eye sockets, he knew what he wanted to do next. He took the very same screwdriver he had used to open the coffin and stabbed it into the corpse of the woman. He claimed to have stabbed her over and over, nearly 50 times, before he snuck out of the cemetery, his arms coated in the slime of the corpse. That experience of desecrating and watching the dead made Nico feel like, in his own words, an emperor reigning in hell. Opening caskets and digging into fresh graves went on to become an obsession of Nico's, a thirst that he needed to quench.
You're doing something that will forever, cast you aside from society. So it was intense, that's all I can say. I also felt this spiritual experience, in a way. I was hyper-focused on what I was doing.
But there were other things that Nico was ruminating on that would forever cast him aside from society. Often, he dreamt about murdering the classmates that teased him.
I would fantasize over stabbing them. At first, the fantasies, they were very, very primitive because I didn't have any grasp of anatomy. So for me, killing somebody was very easy. You just had to stab him in the neck or, it was easy.
Fortunately, Nico didn't act on those feelings, but that didn't stop him from dipping into his darker desires in increasingly concerning and, not to mention, dangerous ways. By the time he turned 17, he was stealing bones and body parts from cemeteries and smuggling them into his house, where he would hide them from his parents in his basement bedroom. At one point, his father discovered a massive bag of mismatched bones beneath his bed. One could only imagine the horror that he felt holding a bag of human bones that he uncovered stashed beneath his teenage son's bed. When his father confronted him, Nico told him that the bones were given to him by a friend, and thus the issue was quickly swept under the rug, though it wasn't the last time that Nico would be confronted. St. Vincent de Paul Hospital in Paris, one of the oldest children's hospitals in the world, the site of countless births, countless deaths, and also the location of Nico Klau's first job as a morgue attendant. The very first autopsy he performed was on a 10-year-old girl, where he learned how to properly stitch up her torso. The job of a morgue attendant is simple: to respect the bodies, assist with the autopsy, and stitch up the body afterwards so that the deceased can be ready to be reunited with their bereaved loved ones for one final time. But being left alone with a body to stitch it up left Nico free to indulge in the darkest of his desires. According to him, it wasn't until he took a job at St. Joseph Hospital in December of 1993 that he had his very first taste of human flesh. He would cut strips of muscle from inside the chest cavity of the cadavers, reviewing the medical files before cutting to ensure that he was eating a person who was relatively healthy. Often, he would eat the meat raw. He has described it as reminding him of steak tartar. Sometimes he would sneak the pieces of abdominal muscle home and fry them. When he was asked how he felt about taking his first bite of human flesh, he responded that he thought, "Cool, I'm a cannibal now."
Because I only had access to flesh from the abdominal cavities. And of course I had this craving for other pieces. but it would imply actually mutilating the cadaver, and would have shown immediately, you know.
Nico's job gave him access to not just dead bodies, but ample amounts of blood.
During the morning, I was working in the morgue, and in the afternoons, I worked in a surgery unit. So one of the tasks that I had to do was to go to the blood bank, get blood bags, and bring them to during the operations. And there was this system with stickers attached to the blood bags. And if some of the blood bags were used during the operation, you had to remove the stickers and bring them back to the blood bank. And of course, when there were bags that were not used, instead of bringing them entirely, I would just bring the sticker and pretend that they had been used, because it was their system of doing it. And I was able to steal several bags a week like that. So I didn't drink everything, of course. It would have made me really sick, I guess.
Once he had the blood bags at home, Nico would drink the blood straight.
Such fine crystal shouldn't go to waste.
On occasion, he would mix it with human ashes or even protein powder to make a shake. He claims that drinking the blood made him feel alive in a way that people who haven't can't comprehend. He described himself as feeling more alive than people who I saw on the subway or even on the streets. For me, everybody looked like ghosts. They had no conscience, and I'd walk among them and feel like I was the only person alive. When he wasn't using the blood for drinking, he would use it in ritual sacrifices. Nico is self-described as a Satanist with a specific interest in Pazuzu, the king of demons. With blood, bones, and human flesh at his disposal, Nico was able to take part in rituals that made him feel what he describes as the energy of the dead. Soon, however, he found himself looking for more. The aforementioned childhood fantasies that Nico had had about murdering his classmates would eventually evolve into daydreams about murdering his co-workers. He planned to murder a total of 3 people. But first, he decided he had to get his feet wet. His girlfriend, at the time, allegedly worked as a dominatrix, using an early form of the internet called the Minitel to reach out to clients.
French have been using the video text for 10 years already. By telephone, they look through an electronic phone book, movie listings, or a database, usually on this type of terminal.
It was here that Nico decided to try his luck. He connected with a homosexual man on a BDSM forum. After chatting for a bit, the man, Thierry Bissonnier, invited Nico to his apartment under the impression that they'd spend the afternoon together. Tragically, this would end up being the last afternoon of Thierry's life. Nico arrived at the apartment concealing a .22 caliber gun in his pocket. When Thierry opened the door to greet the man that he expected to be his lover, he found himself face to face with his killer instead.
And I shot him when he opened the door several times.
Nico riddled Thierry with bullets, an innocent man cut down in his prime and leaving a devastated family behind. But Nico didn't just leave after he shot Thierry. He watched him bleed out on the carpet, then began to meander around, looking around his home as if it was a museum. When he had finished his tour, Nico returned to discover that Thierry was still alive. He was moving and taking gasping breaths, as if he was breathing through a straw. To kill him, Nico lifted a potted plant into the air and smashed it down on Thierry's head, crushing his skull. And before leaving, Nico then cleaned his fingerprints off the potted plant, stole Thierry's wallet, and fled the scene. According to Nico, he didn't feel bad about what he'd done.
No empathy, no. I felt detached, and I was actually observing things and watching things on the side, but there was actually absolutely no emotion.
3 days would go by before Thierry's body was discovered. After not being able to contact him, his parents finally entered his apartment themselves, only to discover the heartbreaking sight of their dead son. Fortunately, they didn't have to wait long for Nico to be apprehended because he soon made a fatal mistake. At a local store, Nico attempted to use one of Thierry's checks to buy a VCR. To prove that his identity matched the name on the checks, Nico showed the cashier Thierry's license, which he had pasted his own picture onto. The cashier quickly caught on to this scam, prompting Nico to flee the scene. His aforementioned fatal mistake, however, was that he left behind Thierry's ID at the store, which once again had his own picture pasted over it. And this would go on to give police a roadmap to exactly who they were searching for. It was here that Nico Clow realized that he was feeling his last few seconds of freedom, at least for a while. Police officers rushed toward him outside the most famous club in Paris, handcuffs at the ready. He had been recognized from the picture he taped over Thierry's ID.
Immediately I knew that it was over because, I didn't care to get rid of any weapon. So everything was at my place.
It wasn't just the gun that was at Nico's place, but there was much, much more. In fact, there was piles of evidence that would go on to earn him the nickname he's still referred to by today. What law enforcement uncovered in Nico's apartment was beyond their wildest nightmares. Stolen human bones, human ashes, and sex tapes of hardcore BDSM were just the beginning. Inside the fridge, the stunned officers found several bags of human blood, the same blood Nico had stolen from the hospital. It was a sickening sight for the officers, but what was even more sickening was Nico's nonchalant confession. He told officers that he had the blood because he enjoyed drinking it, and willingly admitted that he'd been robbing graves in Paris for quite some time. Naturally, this led to a lengthy psychological investigation to ensure that he was fit to stand trial for the murder of Thierry Bissonnier. According to Nico, it was determined that he had a borderline psychotic personality disorder, necrophilia, and sexual sadism, and ultimately he was found guilty of premeditated murder, attempt to defraud, falsification of official documents, as well as armed robbery. However, the most twisted and not to mention concerning part of all this is that Clow was never convicted for any crimes relating to his grave robberies or cannibalism. And despite committing these crimes against humanity, he was sentenced to just 12 years in prison on May 9th of 1997.
Favorite graveyards.
The man who ate flesh from dead bodies, drank the blood of hospital patients, and murdered a man in cold blood, still walks among us as a free man. During his time in prison, he routinely wrote to serial killers, a number of whom allegedly wrote back to him on a regular basis. When he was finally released just 8 years into his 12-year sentence, he was recognized and even celebrated by people with darker interests. Eventually, he would go on to claim that he feared that his ego was growing too much from the fame that came with his crimes.
I had to keep a low profile for this. So this is why I refused to do interviews for a period of 10 years. People thought that I was dead, actually, because I wasn't going to clubs anymore. I wasn't, And then after 10 years of working in different hospitals in Paris, even Catholic institutes and different morgues, I started to get recognized again. And it kind of spread like wildfire in the deaf worker industry. So, people ended up knowing, and I was fired off from 2 different places.
Since being fired from the morgues, Nico has chosen not to hide his identity. He runs an online store and a YouTube channel where he dives into the darker side of humanity. His store, which sells paintings of serial killers, items from crime scenes, and also models of serial killers, continues till this day to serve as a particularly dark look into his psyche. And then there are the sex toys themed after serial killers like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, who, it should be noted, were both convicted rapists.
I want to create a line of dildos based on serial killers. And it was like, this is the craziest and sickest idea I've ever heard, and it's brilliant.
The narrative of true crime is not owned by journalists anymore and TV people. The narrative is owned by the ones who commit the crimes. So that's a totally different perspective. And this is why I love books written by serial killers.
For many people, Nico's actions after his release from prison are red flags, and questions such as should he be able to flourish off the fame that he's gotten from the horrible crimes that he's committed, and also should he be able to sell a cookbook for cannibals and books about his twisted experiences, all for his own gain. Nico doesn't seem entirely concerned with his legacy or even the morality of what he's selling. Instead, he seems to relish in the position he's found himself in.
What's the first thing you'll do when you arrive in hell?
I will greet all the guys, checkmate, tac, look for my throne, sit on it, and yeah.
Let the fun begin.
If you found this episode interesting, then our previous episode about the most evil couple in recorded history is likely to do the same. You can find it at the end screen of this video.